Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're cutting straight to a really complex global issue. It's that fascinating and, let's be honest, often very prickly place where international politics meets a country's own justice system.
Yeah.
We're going to get into the weeds on sources that look at judicial independence and specifically these very public actions by some U.S. lawmakers aimed squarely at India's legal system.
And our mission today is pretty specific. We're looking at the source material to really understand the context around the trial of activist Umar Khalid.
Uh-huh.
He's facing some very serious charges under India's Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, the UAPA.
Okay.
And crucially, we need to understand why this foreign involvement is being so forcefully described by the Indian government as, an unwarranted interference in their own affairs.
And we have a very specific starting point for all this tension. It was a formal letter sent on December 30th, 2025. It went right to the Indian ambassador to the United States, Vinay Mohan Quatra. And this wasn't just some vague statement. It was a targeted move. It was trying to influence the trial standards and specifically the bail conditions for Khalid.
So let's start there. Let's unpack the mechanics of this move. The sources are pretty clear about who was involved in pushing this. The letter had 8 U.S. lawmakers on it, and the effort was really spearheaded by 2 prominent Democrats,
Who were they?
Congressman Jim McGovern and Congressman Jamie Raskin.
Right, I've heard those names. So it was a coordinated effort from Capitol Hill.
Oh, absolutely. And it wasn't just them. You had figures like Senator Chris Van Hollen, Senator Peter Welch, Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, Rashida Tlaib. It was a significant group trying to exert real political pressure.
Now, before that official letter, the sources mentioned something else happened, a kind of prelude involving a local American politician. How did that set the stage for all of this?
It was a very high-profile and symbolic act. The official letter came right after the newly elected mayor of New York, Zohran Mamdani, did something very public.
Who was that?
He personally handed a note of solidarity to Umar Khalid's parents. They were visiting the U.S. in early December. And this wasn't some quiet backroom meeting. It was a gesture designed to, elevate Khalid's case from an Indian national security trial to this global cause.
A cause being championed by American politicians.
Exactly.
So this gets us to the key conflict, right? You have the lawmakers using the language of human rights, of protecting dissent, but then India's External Affairs Ministry just immediately calls it unwarranted interference. Why is a letter seen as crossing such a line?
Well, it comes down to diplomatic protocol and really respecting the separation of powers.
Okay.
The sources emphasize that by sending a letter directly to the ambassador and demanding changes to an active judicial process. I mean, they were asking India to change its bail conditions.
They're trying to dictate the outcome.
Precisely. From India's perspective, this is an attempt to undermine their institutional integrity. It suggests that India's courts are either, incompetent or politically biased and need to be corrected from the outside.
So the argument is instead of helping justice, they're actually trying to undermine another democracy's rule of law. And I imagine that's especially sensitive given the law he's charged under, the UAPA.
Absolutely. The UAPA is India's main anti-terror law. It's, comparable to some of the security laws we've seen in the U.S. or the U.K. after 9/11.
And that context is key, isn't it?
It's crucial. The reason pretrial detention can be so long under this law is that the burden of proof for getting bail is incredibly high. The court basically has to be convinced that the state's allegations are, on the face of it, untrue.
Wow.
So the default isn't bail. The default is detention, unless you can prove the case has no merit from the very start.
Yeah.
That's a huge piece of context for what happens next.
Okay, so let's unpack that. The sources talk about a stark selectivity, even calling it a left lobby agenda. What evidence is there to suggest this advocacy for Khalid was selective and not just, a focused campaign?
Well, the clearest evidence actually comes from the Indian judiciary itself, just days after that U.S. letter was sent.
Okay, what happened?
So you have to remember, this case stems from the massive communal riots in northeast Delhi back in February 2020. These were incredibly serious clashes that left dozens of people dead. And all these individuals, including Khalid, were charged under the UAPA in connection with those events.
Right.
Then, on January 5th, 2026, the Indian Supreme Court does something really interesting. It grants bail to 5 other people accused in the very same riot case.
5 other people.
Yes. Shifa-ur-Rehman, Shadab Ahmed, Miran Haider, Gulfishan Fatima, and Mohammed Salim Khan. This shows the judiciary is actively looking at the evidence for each person and making different decisions.
That's a huge counterpoint to the idea that this is just some kind of blanket political persecution. The court is letting people go.
It is, and the sources really highlight the case of Shifa Rahman to show the disparity. He was the president of the Jamia Alumni Association, known for doing actual charity work, funding housing for rural students.
So a community leader.
Right. But according to the source material, his case just didn't have the, quote, ideological glamour to make international headlines or get the attention of U.S. lawmakers. He didn't fit the narrative, so his long detention was basically ignored by the outside world.
So the big takeaway here, for you, the listener, is that the courts seem to be making these really nuanced calls. They grant bail to Rahman and 4 others, but they deny it to Khalid and another man, Sharjeel Imam.
Exactly. It suggests they're looking at specific evidence, the gravity of the charges for each individual, and not just bending to international pressure or political affiliation.
It shows the rule of law is actually working, making distinctions between general dissent and what the state alleges is something far more serious.
Right. The state is arguing that some of this rhetoric crossed a line into actually planning the territorial dismantling of the country.
Okay, so since the courts did release 5 people, let's look at what the sources say convinced those same courts to keep Khalid and Imam in detention. This has to go back to that high bail standard for the UAPA you mentioned.
This is where it's absolutely central. Because the court has to find the state's case to be prima facie true, the documented words of the accused become the core evidence.
And what do Khalid say?
Well, Khalid, who identifies as a communist atheist, has a documented history that the state argues is a direct threat to India's territorial integrity. For instance, the sources note his frequent public references to Kashmir as occupied territory.
And for context, Kashmir is a constitutionally recognized part of India.
With a, as the source notes, 5,000-year historical tie. So calling it occupied territory is seen as moving beyond political critique into calling for the actual balkanization of the country.
And it gets more specific than that, doesn't it?
Oh yes, the sources point to even more inflammatory rhetoric. He publicly eulogized Burhan Wani.
Who was he?
He was a commander of the terrorist group Hizbul Mujahideen, killed in a firefight with security forces. Khalid posted a tribute to him online, citing Che Guevara, and wrote, "Rest in power, Burhan. #Free Kashmir."
So he's framing a militant leader as a revolutionary hero.
Unambiguously. And that's a major national security red flag in that context.
The source material draws a pretty powerful analogy here to help an American audience understand the severity of that. What was it?
Yeah, it's a stark comparison. The source says it would be like a prominent Harvard scholar publicly mourning, say, Qasem Soleimani or even Osama bin Laden as a hero of the people, while at the same time calling for a U.S. state like Texas or California to secede.
Okay, that definitely puts it in a different light. It's not about policy disagreement anymore.
No. It's about praising figures engaged in armed conflict against the state while demanding territory be broken off. That elevates it to a whole different level of threat.
And what about Sharjeel Imam? The sources say his alleged actions were just as focused on the physical dismantling of the state.
Terrifyingly specific, according to the sources. In recorded speeches, he laid out a clear, actionable plan to cut off Northeast India from the rest of the country.
How?
By blockading a very narrow strip of land called the Siliguri Corridor, which is famously known as the Chicken's Neck.
For our listeners who might not know the geography, why is that corridor so important?
It's the only land bridge connecting mainland India to its 7 northeastern states. It's barely 22 kilometers wide at its narrowest point.
So if you block that.
You choke off those 7 states,
Yeah.
you effectively sever them from the country. And Imam explicitly called for mass mobilization to do this, to permanently separate Assam from the Indian Union. The sources argue when you move from protest to detailing strategic plans to fracture the country, the legal response is going to shift to national security.
Okay, so this is where we get to the whole people in glass houses argument. The source material really digs into what it sees as hypocrisy, with the U.S. lecturing India while having its own very strict laws against this kind of thing.
It does. The sources list specific U.S. legal precedents. Take 18 U.S.C. Section 2383. That law is crystal clear. The U.S. government can imprison anyone who incites, sets on foot, assists, or engages in any rebellion or insurrection.
And the Supreme Court has backed this up historically.
For centuries. The landmark case, Texas v. White in 1869, established that the Union is indissoluble. States don't have a right to just unilaterally secede. The U.S. has always acted with extreme legal force against any hint of breaking up the Union.
So the critique is pretty sharp then. If U.S. lawmakers were faced with a scholar celebrating a known terrorist and calling for a blockade to help a state secede, they would likely be calling for the harshest possible charges under their own laws.
That's the core of the argument. The letter from the lawmakers relied on these broad appeals to international human rights standards, about pretrial detention and free speech.
Right.
But they essentially ignored the specific UAPA charges, the calls for balkanization, the strategic planning. They just framed it as suppression of political dissent.
Oh.
And that allows them to apply a standard they would never, ever accept at home.
And this critique about priorities is then also aimed at the local level, at Mayor Zohran Mamdani.
Yes, those sources are very critical here. They ask why the mayor of New York is so focused on a foreign criminal trial when NYC has these crippling local crises.
What kind of crises?
They cite a housing vacancy rate of just 1.4%, which is staggeringly low. It means it's almost impossible for normal families to find a place to live. Crumbling infrastructure and, these big unfulfilled promises to build 200,000 affordable homes and raise the minimum wage.
It definitely paints a picture of global posturing taking precedence over the real, immediate problems his own constituents are facing.
And if you connect all this back to India's democracy, the source reminds us that the country they're criticizing is home to over 250 million Muslims. That's a larger population than any single Arab nation.
A huge, diverse community.
Made up of all these thriving traditions, Sufi, Shia, Bora, and they're all protected by the very same courts that these U.S. lawmakers are now calling compromised.
And the sources point out that this isn't the first time the U.S. has gotten this kind of pushback, is it?
Not at all. It's a pattern. There were similar sharp rebukes from Saudi Arabia over U.S. interference regarding the execution of Nimr al-Nimr and the Khashoggi investigation. In both cases, the response was, this is a blatant interference in our sovereign judicial matters.
So wrapping this all up, what does it all mean? The overall theme from the sources seems to be that a partnership between the world's oldest and largest democracies has to be based on mutual respect. Treating India as a peer, not a subordinate that needs some kind of white savior influence.
And the source's conclusion really reasserts that. It says the Indian judiciary's recent decisions bailing 5 people while holding 2 shows a nuanced, evidence-based approach.
Not a broken system.
Not at all. It shows a system distinguishing between those who posed a lesser threat and those held because of the alleged gravity of their strategic actions against the state. The sources contend this is just how the rule of law works in any sovereign nation when it's faced with what it sees as a threat of sedition.
It certainly challenges that simple narrative that the system is just politically motivated, especially when you see them actively releasing people from the same case.
Right. The argument is the Indian judiciary has proven it can be both firm in protecting the state and fair in assessing individual cases, and that it refuses to be bullied by international headlines.
That's a really powerful analysis, and it provides a lot of context that's often missing from the international coverage. We've looked at the players, the implied hypocrisy, and the specific rhetoric that seems to be guiding the judicial response, which leaves a final, maybe provocative thought for you, the listener. If the goal is legitimate human rights advocacy, where exactly do you draw the line between protecting fiery political dissent and protecting individuals who explicitly call for a nation's physical balkanization? That's the fundamental question to mull over as you connect this to the broader global stage.